Former Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara made a documentary titled The Fog of War: Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara. He was Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well as the war in Vietnam. He says, lesson number one, empathize with your enemy. That's what I call empathy. We must try to put ourselves inside their skin and look at us through their eyes, just to understand the thoughts that lie behind their decisions and their actions. This is why even serial killers get to take the stand during their trial. This is why you have to hear the defense, not just the prosecution. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the end, I think we did put ourselves in the skin of the Soviets. In the case of Vietnam, we didn't know them well enough to empathize, and there was a total misunderstanding as a result. They believed we had simply replaced the French as a colonial power, and we were seeking to subject South and North Vietnam to our colonial interests, which was absolutely absurd. And we saw Vietnam as an element of the Cold War, not what they saw it as, a civil war. I have been researching the topic of warfare, politics, history, along with 9/11 for more than a decade. Here are some lessons I think we can take from this tragedy and hope to find some productive way of going about things in the future. Lesson number one, do not let tragedies put you in a state of mind which allows you to be manipulated into becoming the very thing you claim to oppose. Warfare is based on lies. Politicians engage in threat inflation and explicit lies, a necessary tactic to get people to put their lives on the line unnecessarily. Doing nothing is better than doing something bad and counterproductive. Civilians frequently have to bear the cost of decisions made by politicians, known as blowback, when a few politicians and contractors and soldiers benefit at the expense of their domestic population. People who pay no price for being wrong or acting immorally, politicians, are more likely to act recklessly since they are coercively funded with taxation and face legal immunity with regard to killing civilians. God says, thou shalt not murder. He does not make exceptions for people born in distant geographical areas. The inequality between the state and the citizenry is the most dangerous inequality in society. Finally, it shouldn't take an act of terrorism for Americans to unify. Americans should be proud of the achievements of workers and entrepreneurs in the voluntary sector who raise the world's living standards to heights never imagined by kings or queens of the past. The following excerpt is from a speech I gave in New York City at the Blockchain Center titled "The State is the Health of War." Thank you for watching the Libertarian Institute and Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. Go back to September 20th of 2001. President George W. Bush addressed Congress and said the following: Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. Here are Osama bin Laden's actual words, published in a book titled Al-Qaeda in its own words, published by Harvard University. The section is titled Tactical Recommendations. Bin Laden says, then the fighters realized that the gang in the White House could not see things clearly, and that their leader, that idiot they obey, was claiming that we envied their lifestyle, when the truth which this pharaoh would like to hide is that we are attacking them because of their injustice toward the Muslim world and especially Palestine and Iraq, as well as their occupation of the land of the two sanctuaries. When the fighters saw this, they decided to come out of the shadows and take the fight into their territory, into their homes. And herein lies the importance of libertarianism. We are going to be in a continuous back and forth of fake divides. Black versus white, man versus woman, rich versus poor, Muslim versus non-Muslim, Russia versus America, China versus America. The only justifiable divide in society that we should tolerate are those who achieve their ends by initiating fraud and violence against peaceful people, and those who achieve their ends through peaceful trade and voluntary cooperation. Even the invasion of Afghanistan after September 11, 2001 was not necessary, but because the state is the health of war, the politicians who got us in there knew they weren't going to have to pay the price. In fact, it would actually win them a lot of friends along with defense contractors, and none of them were afraid that they might go to jail if they kill any civilians or wage an unjust war. That is another example of how the state is the health of war. The Guardian, October 14, 2001. Bush rejects Taliban offer to hand bin Laden over. The president said the bombing would not stop unless the ruling Taliban turn bin Laden over, turn his cohorts over, turn any hostages they hold over. He added, "No need to discuss innocence or guilt. We know he's guilty." Haji Abdul Kabir, the third most powerful figure in the ruling Taliban regime, told reporters that the Taliban would require evidence that bin Laden was behind the September 11th terrorist attacks in the U.S., but added, "We would be ready to hand him over to a third country." If the Taliban is given evidence that Osama bin Laden is involved and the bombing campaign stopped, we would be ready to hand him over to a third country, Mr. Kabir added. Along with the invasion of Iraq, another example of how the state is the health of war, this invasion was based but primarily on lies. George W. Bush, in his 2003 State of the Union address, said, "The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa." This was refuted in an article titled "What I Didn't Find in Africa" by Joe Wilson, who was the alleged source of this uranium purchase. He is the husband of Valerie Plame. Vice President Dick Cheney went on Meet the Press December 9, 2001, and was referring to Muhammad Atta, the infamous September 11th hijacker, saying, "It's been pretty well confirmed that he, Atta, did go to Prague, and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service." Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos on ABC News March of 2003, saying, "We know where they are, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad, and east, west, south, and north somewhat." When it comes to the invasion of Syria, here is another lie that the war on terror has something to do with fighting against al-Qaeda. It actually involves allying with al-Qaeda in a number of instances. Here is Jake Sullivan, the current National Security Advisor for President Joe Biden, in an email sent to Hillary Clinton on February 12th, 2012. Sullivan says, "See last item, AQ is on our side in Syria. Otherwise, things have basically turned out as expected." This is high-level officials knowing for a fact that the U.S. is on the side of al-Qaeda in Syria for the sake of taking down the Bashar al-Assad regime, which Obama publicly came out and said Assad can no longer be the prime minister of Syria. He's an illegitimate ruler. When it comes to Libya, two headlines from the New York Times will do. First one, from 2011, says, "U.S. tactics in Libya may be a model for other efforts." Couple years later, 2015, New York Times says, "ISIS's grip on Libyan city gives it a fallback option." So the foreign policy to take out a terrible dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, ended with the Islamic State controlling large portions of Libya. This is the organization they were allying with in Syria. These wars are to the point where they are so unjustifiable. Major neoconservative Max Boot published an article in Foreign Affairs, to his credit, titled "What Neocons Got Wrong and How the Iraq War Taught Me About the Limits of American Power." Boot says, March 10th, 2023. Regime change obviously did not work out as intended. The occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq were in fact fiascos that exacted a high price in both blood and treasure for both the United States and, even more, of course, the countries it invaded. Robert A. Pape and James K. Feldman wrote a book titled "Cutting the Fuse: The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It." On page 8, they describe the book as the first complete data set of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world from 1980 to 2009. Their research concludes with nearly all emerged from communities resisting foreign military occupation. from the introduction. From 1980 to 2003, there were 345 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 524 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves on a mission to kill others, half of whom are secular. The world leader was the Tamil Tigers, a secular Hindu group who carried out more attacks than Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, during this period. Further, at least a third of the suicide attacks in predominantly Muslim countries were carried out by secular terrorist groups such as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, in Turkey. Instead of religion, what over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks before 2004 had in common was a strategic goal to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces that are threatening territory that the terrorists prize. From Lebanon to Sri Lanka to the West Bank to Chechnya, the central goal of every suicide terrorist campaign has been to resist military occupation by a democracy. The authors go on to summarize their findings. Number 1, strong confirmation for the hypothesis that military occupation is the main factor driving suicide terrorism. The stationing of foreign combat forces, ground and tactical Air Force units, on territory that terrorists prize accounts for 87% of the over 1,800 suicide terrorist attacks around the world since 2004. Number 2, strong evidence for new hypotheses about the causes of transnational suicide terrorism. Dying to Win, Robert Pape's previous book, explained that nationalism, the desire to perpetuate the local political, religious, and social institutions of a community independent of foreign interference, is the taproot explanation for why individuals from a community facing foreign military occupation would undertake costly measures to defend it, including in extremist suicide terrorism. It was the Hindu, avowedly anti-religious Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, in Sri Lanka, whose 157 suicide terrorists totaled more than Hamas and all other Palestinian suicide groups combined. Of the Palestinian suicide terrorists, more than a third were from secular groups, such as Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. Of the suicide terrorists associated with Hezbollah in Lebanon during the 1980s, only 21% were Islamic fundamentalists, while 71% were communists and socialists. 8% were Christians. In Turkey, 100% of the PKK's suicide attackers were secular. Overall, Islamic fundamentalism cannot account for over half of the known affiliations of the 524 suicide terrorists from 1980 to 2003. 184 were from Islamic fundamentalist groups, 35% comprising 73 Al-Qaeda, 5 Lebanese, 5 Kashmiri rebels, 69 Hamas, 34 Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and 236 from secular groups. 45% comprising 157 Tamil Tigers, 42 Al-Aqsa, 22 Lebanese, 15 PKK, while 21% had unknown ideological affiliations. The authors then quote 3 of the alleged Saudi hijackers. First, Abu al-Jarrah al-Ghamidi. What is happening in Muslim countries today? Blatant occupation, about which there is no doubt. There is no duty more obligatory after faith than to repel him. Second, Abu Musab Walid al-Shari. The occupation and deterioration in the land of the 2 sanctuaries is a plot by the Jew and the Nazarenes, foremost among them, America. May Allah destroy it, which has been among the chief causes of every misfortune suffered by Islam and the Muslims. Thus, repelling the Americans occupying the land of the 2 sanctuaries is the most obligatory of obligations. Finally, Hamza al-Ghamdi, and I say to America, if it wants its armies and people to be safe, then it must withdraw all of its forces from Muslim lands and depart from all our countries. If not, let it await the men prepare the coffins, and dig graves for its citizens. The authors finished the introduction saying further, notice that there are no suicide attackers from Iran, one of the largest Islamic fundamentalist populations in the world, with a population greater than Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, and Syria combined.